lesson here, we've got our render queue all done, and I'll just go ahead and delete that job just to kind of keep it clean here so we can see where we're working. And what we want to do is now render our rib pass. So we're going to need to change some things with our compositing tags. So what I'm going to do is just render the ribs into that same object buffer. So I'll just grab the tag and drop it on the ribs and then delete the tag for the other object. And then we'll actually turn off the visibility in the editor and renderer for the sphere and sweep and turn it on for the ribs. Okay, so this is kind of what we've got. Now, let's go into our render settings, and I'm going to uncheck the save, and in my output I'm going to switch it to current frame, and let's just see what happens if we just render this really quickly to the just to the picture viewer. So I'll hit Shift R, and you can see that the issue that we've got, and the reason why we needed to render this out twice, is that we need our sphere back here to cover up the back of the ball. So the back face culling really only works in our picture or in our view here, not in the actual render. So even though we've got our object buffer, it's not really doing exactly what we want. So we need to turn back on our sphere so that it obscures that. But I don't want to actually render this color out. So if I hit Shift R, you can see now we've got this looking the way we want, where the back of it is obscured, but if we're looking at our color, this is what we see. And I don't really need this image. So we can fix that in our render settings where we don't even render this part of our pass out. So what I'll do is I'll go into my render settings, and if we go to our save, I'll check back on the save, and then I'll just uncheck the regular image save here. We only want to render that object buffer. So then we'll just come in here and change the name from buffer 1 to buffer 2. And then we'll save that, and we'll go back to our output and say we're ready for all of our frames again. And then we'll go save this as 6 end, so we'll save as 06 end, and then we're ready to add it to the render queue again. So we'll add it to our render queue, give it a moment to queue up, and then we'll just go ahead and hit start rendering. So that's going to render just the object buffer out for us, and then we'll be able to come back in our next lesson and bring our passes into After Effects. So stick around and we'll begin our compositing process and after the passes. Okay, so we're here in your project files, and we just want to go into your reference files folder and go into your color and buffers, and we'll just go ahead and click one of those sequences, make sure that the TIFF sequence is checked on, and we'll import that as a footage clip. And then I'll just repeat the process for buffer 2 and for the color pass. Now I also want to bring in my basketball footage, so I'm just going to go back up a few here into my project files, go into my Cinema 4D files, and in the text folder, that's where we've got our man playing basketball, so I'll bring that in. Now, you can see that this is all coming in at slightly different frame rates, and so what I want to do is set it all to be 24 frames per second, just so that it's rounded out and it's closest to what the original footage is. So I'm going to reinterpret everything to be 24 frames per second. So you can just come in here, select a piece of footage, right click, go to interpret footage main, and type in 24, and it will assume the new frame rate that you are telling it to have. Perfect. So now we've got all of these working at 24 frames per second, and that does make a difference in how long our composition would be. So I'm going to grab the man playing basketball here and left click and drag him onto the create a new composition button. And now we've got this new composition created with the footage being interpreted at the rate we want. And now we can come in and start adding our clips. So I'm going to start by bringing our color on top here. And you can see we've got the ball. It's kind of matching up with where he was. And what we need to do is grab our first buffer to cut this away. So I'm going to drop the buffer on top here. Looks good, matches perfectly. And we'll just go into our toggle switches and modes so that we can see our track mat and mode options. And we're going to choose just a simple Luma mat. So when I click that, you can see it cuts away the background and leaves us with the nice little trail here. So that's going to move along with our guy. I'm going to switch this off of adaptive resolution so you can see the final resolution and how pretty this looks. So we've got this pretty much in place here. Now what I want to do is take my second buffer, the one that we created for just the basketball ribs, and cut that out so that those ribs always look like they're on top of everything. Okay, so to do that, we'll go ahead and pre-compose this little 2-layer structure we have here so that this can then become the one layer that we're cutting away from. Otherwise, it won't work where we can just use buffer 2 on top of these two. It won't make any sense to it. So we need to pre-compose that. So we'll select both of those, hit Control-Shift-C, and we'll call this ball color alpha. And go ahead and say OK to that. And then we'll grab buffer 2 and drag that on top of ball color alpha. And we'll do the same thing where we add a Luma mat. And it looks like actually for this one we'll want to invert it because we want to be cutting away. So if I come in here, you can see we've got the color of the ball coming through. So that's perfect. That's exactly what we are wanting. So let's go ahead and play this back. And you can see that now we've got a nice little cutout on top of everything, and it always appears to be in front, which is exactly what we want. Okay, so now I'm going to shift select both of those layers, and we'll Control-Shift-C and call this ball cutout. Okay. So now we've got our ball composited on top of our footage, and we're ready to start adding some really awesome effects that are going to really start bringing this ball to life and making it feel more integrated with the rest of the shot. So the rest of the course is going to be about how to get this to look integrated and not just kind of slapped on top of everything else. So in our next lesson, we're going to come in and start adding some glows to this ball to really make it feel like it's not just this graphical thing, but that it has some energy and some power to it. So let's come back in this panel so that we have access to the glow. And that's going to be the glow that's here under Stylize. So we'll go ahead and grab that and drop it onto our ball cutout layer. And then I'm going to change partially the way that this is being affected. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. And I'm going to change this from being based on the color channel to the alpha channel. And you can see how that kind of changes how this looks. It's more around the edges. So we'll be able to really start seeing a very different affect than probably what you're used to when you mess with a traditional looking glow. I'm going to turn up the glow threshold so that we get a little bit more of that kind of yellow, so you can see sort of what that looks like. So not all the way to 100, but pretty close. Right in that area there. And then the glow radius I'm going to leave the same. Maybe we can turn up the glow intensity just slightly, and then we'll leave where this is being composited as behind, and we'll leave this as add, and it's going to automatically change kind of those options from what they originally would have been. How do we not change that to alpha channel? And then if we want to maybe mess with the color loops a little bit, we can come in there. And you can see the more you add, kind of the more little edges you get. So maybe something like 3 would be kind of interesting. So we get sort of this nice little hot edge right around there. And then I want to add another glow on top of this one. So I'm going to add a second glow here. And then we'll just kind of go in and start editing this one as well. So again, I'm going to increase the glow threshold this time so that we get some of that orange back. And then we'll also increase the glow radius. So this is going to come out quite a bit farther, but we'll decrease the glow intensity so it's not quite so much. There we go. and then we'll leave these settings the same, the color loops the same, all of that. Now this looks okay, but it doesn't feel integrated still, but we've got a really nice glow thing going on here. But one way that we can make this look much better is by changing the mode from normal to add. So that's really going to help it to feel more like it's actually here, and when we're scrubbing on top of things, you can kind of see through it, and this just feels way better already. Now, I think that this could really stand to look a little bit less yellow and a little more orange. So I'm going to add another effect called hue saturation. And if we just drop this on, it's actually going to come after everything else. And I want it to happen before the glows are applied. So I'm going to take it up to the top. So your stacking order of effects should look like this, where hue saturation is at the top. And then we can just come into our hue and start to drag this over to the left, and we get a much more orange look. And if you change your mind and decide, hey, I don't want this to be orange at all, you could pick a lot of different colors here. So I'm just going to very slightly tweak that to about -14 so you can see the difference in the yellow. And I think this just helps the glow to stand out more because we get the heat, but we don't have so much of kind of the other issue going on that we were seeing, where the yellow and the white almost look like the same color. So that looks pretty good, but you'll see that if I just play this back, I'm just going to hit the 0 key on my number pad to start playing this back. First of all, we need to kind of fade this in because right now it's just sort of floating there, and that doesn't look quite right. So we'll want to fade that in over time. But aside from that issue, once we start really seeing this moving around and through his legs and all of that kind of stuff, it really breaks the illusion that the glow is always in front of him, instead of feeling like it actually went through his leg and his leg kind of obscured that. So you'll see what I mean here. Here the ball is behind him, but it appears on top. So that really breaks the illusion that this is actually happening, and that the glow is kind of moving in and around him. So we are going to need to do some rotoscoping to kind of cover up what we've got, kind of how this is interacting with his body. So what I want to do is come in and start masking the leg and the hand to really begin creating that effect. So we'll come back in the next lesson and begin easier. I'm going to once again pre-compose this so that we're just working on a fresh layer. So I'm going to select my layer, hit Control-Shift-C, and we'll call this ball with glow effects. And then we'll want to move all attributes into the new composition. Okay, so now that has moved in there. You'll see we lost our blending mode, but we can quickly get that back by setting it back to add. Okay, perfect. So now we're ready to begin adding our effects and, or rather our masks. So one of the other things we need to do is kind of have this come on over time. So probably right about here on, well, we're on frame 60. We know that's going to be the right frame. So we can actually just go into our composition settings and make sure our start time code is 0. Okay, and then I can control click over here and make sure I'm on frame 60. And this is where I want this to begin coming into our vision here. So I'm going to turn on the opacity property just by hitting the T key, and we'll put that at 100 and then kind of drag that keyframe forward and then take it down to 0. And let's do this over about 15 frames. So if I hit shift and hit page down, that's 10, and then hit page down 5 more times, that'll take us to the full 15. So just pull that forward so you can see that's going to kind of come into view just like this. Perfect. Okay, so now we're ready to begin masking. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my pen tool, and I want to start with his fingers that we see up here. I actually want to start on this very first frame of the transition because this is where we want it to look like his fingers are on top of that, and then we'll end up kind of changing it so it looks like they go through the glow. So I'm going to begin just making a mask around his fingers, that we can then really quickly and easily move. So if you've watched any of my rotoscoping courses or any rotoscoping courses, you'll see that it's better to kind of do things like fingers and arms more individually. At the time it may not seem faster, but once you actually start moving them, it's going to just give you more control, and you have less problems with things like edge swimming, which is going to be really helpful for us to save some time. So that's why I want to just kind of do this the right way the first time and go ahead and add as many masks as we need to get the best result. So just kind of quickly coming in here and creating those is going to be the best bet. Okay, and then I'm going to add one more that's kind of for his whole hand, just like that, in case we need to have kind of more going on up here. And I'll just hold Alt to kind of pull just that one anchor back in. Perfect. Okay, so what we'll want to do is go into our masks, select all 6 masks, and we'll go ahead and key that mask path for all of those. Then let's go forward a few frames here, just maybe like right down there, and we'll select all of these masks, just like that. And then let's double click to select all of them, and then we'll kind of pull this back down and get it close into position, and you'll realize that we're kind of getting a strange effect here. This isn't exactly what we want. So we want these masks to be set to subtract instead of add. So I'm going to change them all to subtract, and since I have them all selected, I can do that really quickly and easily. And then we'll want to just begin coming in here and moving the finger masks a little bit more individually so that we get more control and that these just look like they are matching up with his hand a little bit better. Okay, so just kind of coming in like this, and once you have this selected, you can just hit the enter key whenever you have that box around it like this, hit enter, and then you can go back to just moving individual points. It's a little bit faster than having to go through and manually deselect to get out of that mode. Okay, so that's looking pretty good there. Maybe pull that one up a little bit more, and his pinky fingers closer up here. Perfect. Okay, and we'll want to move this mask, this last 6th mask here, and kind of have that encompass a little bit more of his entire hand. There we go, just to make that glow look a little bit better. Now these look pretty harsh, so even if I had them perfectly matching up with his fingers, which I'm going to go in between lessons and make them a little bit better, but this is just so you get the idea of kind of what we're shooting for here. We need to feather these masks anyway, because you're not going to have a true 1 pixel line. You can see everything has a little bit of a feather just because we're working with live footage. So I'm going to change this mask feather to a 1 pixel feather. And it doesn't need to be a keyed property. We just want it to have 1 pixel of feathering, just to help make them look a little softer and a little more realistic. And already that looks better. Okay, so when we're at 100%, this is what it looks like. So this finger still is looking a little odd. So let's come in there and fix that up a little bit. Okay. Okay, better. So now we'll want to go in between there and kind of start getting these masks to match up better with the rest of his hand. So again, we'll just select all the masks and double click and move. And again, this is going to be one of those things where I know you don't want to watch me rotoscope his hand for hours and hours, so we'll be able to just go in between lessons and you can work on this on your own, or I will just finish it and you can grab that project file and kind of start from there. Just because this process is so intensive doesn't mean you need to see every single click to know how to do it. It really just will be a huge time commitment for you to see all of that happening. Okay, so we've kind of got the idea here that our mask is moving with his hand, and we'll need to kind of pull that through, but not too much further than really what we've got here, because what I want to have happen is that in this amount of time, especially once we get to about right here, I want his fingers to look like they have passed through this little tail. So we can do that by adding some expansion to our masks, and it will actually be negative expansion. So I'm going to go ahead and key the expansion property for all the masks when I'm right here on the first keyframe of the mask path, and that also is the first key of the main opacity of the whole ball and its transition to being visible. So then we'll come to this frame right here, and I'm going to just come in, and you can kind of see what that expansion does. So I'm going to pull this in until we're no longer visible there in the middle. So that's -23 for this one, but it's going to be less for the other ones, like the little fingers and stuff. So for that one it was only 9, and you can kind of see how now we're getting the effect that his finger is sort of passing through kind of from the topmost part of the knuckle, the part that would stick up the most. So this is what that's going to kind of look like. So it looks like he's passing through that. And you may want to kind of adjust that a little bit if you want it to happen a little bit later, but this is just the part where we have the mask keyed, so it's easiest to see. So that is the mask for just his arm, but you'll also want to go through and begin creating a mask for this area right here. So right here we would want to have a mask for kind of his pant leg and this part of his leg. So lots of masking needs to occur for that to happen. Now, one quick thing I want to show you, I'm just kind of quickly drawing this, is that again this one needs to be set to subtract, but just for this part of the leg, let's say, you know, I have that keyed with the mask path there, but anything that would come before that, even though it's not on his leg, I don't really want to spend a lot of time getting this to match up perfectly with his leg right here, because I don't need it until later. So one thing you can do is before that, when the ball, before it goes behind anything, you can have a keyframe that just kind of pulls it off screen, and then in the next frame you can bring that in, and it'll just be like a little one frame transition for that leg to become obscured by the mask. So that's really a helpful little technique when you're doing a lot of masking like this and you want to save time. So you would go in and make that a little more perfect and add another one for his pants. So I'm going to go in between lessons and get the masking for our glowing ball, for his hand and arm and everything, and get those all worked out so that when the ball is passing behind him like this, we are not seeing it. So that's quite a bit of rotoscoping to get done. And it's not something I want to take your time up with watching. So we'll come back in the next lesson and that will all be finished, and then we'll begin talking about how we want to relight the ground. So stick around to our lesson to show you kind of what I did with the rotoscoping. So we can just kind of watch this through here. I just hit 0 on my number pad, and you can see how now this feels so much more integrated with all these rotoscopes, and there's quite a few of them, just to kind of get him here at different spots and just making that look more integrated, how they kind of pop on and off so that none of them are in the way when they shouldn't be. So you can kind of see how that works. So now we're going to be helping this ball to look more integrated by creating kind of a little gradient sort of looking light that's going to follow this around. So right now we have a shadow, which is still, we can't totally get rid of the shadow, but just having a little bit of light that will track along with us on the ground is really going to help to make that look a little more realistic. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to come in here, and just right here where it hits the ground is really where I want to focus on just getting this started. So I'm going to create a new black solid. So go in and create a solid, and you want to make it solid black. And then I'm going to open back up my effects and presets panel so we can grab ourselves a gradient ramp effect. So that's going to be this one right here, gradient ramp. You just go ahead and drop that onto your black solid. Now for this to look like a light, we need it to be a radial ramp shape instead of linear. So go ahead and switch that, and then you'll want to go ahead and just kind of bring that into the middle like this. And then we also have an end of ramp option that we can kind of come in. So this is how we sort of get to decide how big this is going to be. So I'm going to pull it up here so it's kind of closer to the edge but not falling off of the edge. That's really important. And then this, you can see kind of how that works as far as how those two little targets work in conjunction with one another. So what we want to do now is change the coloring of this. So I want the inside of the ramp to be kind of an orangey color so that we have sort of this light, and then the outside I'm going to make black. Okay, so that's why we were kind of doing the black solid so it would be easier to tell. But let's go ahead and just rename that black solid by right-clicking and choosing rename. And we'll call this ground relight. Okay, now to get this to actually start meshing with our ground, what we want to do is change it to a blend mode of add. Okay, so you can kind of see how that already has a very different look to it. Now I'm also going to toggle my switches and modes so I can get into my 3D mode, and now that this is a 3D layer, I can actually rotate it here along the x-axis and start to kind of mimic the positioning of my ground plane. So you can kind of see how I can get that into position there. Now this obviously is just kind of a rough look. This is just kind of where we're at with it right now. We'll tweak it quite a bit, but this is actually looking pretty good for what it is, but I feel like it could look a little more diffuse. So let's add a lens blur and kind of increase that blur radius, and you'll notice that that just has a lot softer look to it. That's just gonna be a little bit easier to work with. So maybe it doesn't need to be blurred quite that much. Maybe you could do something a little bit smaller, maybe like 150, 100, somewhere in there. And then I'm also going to add an exposure effect. And this is because I want to be able to control the brightness of this. So you'll notice when I turn up the exposure it looks much brighter. When I turn it down it looks much dimmer. But the important thing is if I turn off this exposure effect, and let's say I was just controlling its visibility using the opacity, if I select this, hit the T key, you can see that when the opacity is changing, it's not really giving it the same kind of look as what you get when you're controlling the exposure. So that's why I'm going to leave it at about 100 and then use just the opacity to control how bright, or excuse me, rather the exposure to control how bright this looks. So probably don't ever want to get much brighter than something like this. And if you feel like it still looks a little just too over the top, you could go in and change this from add to screen, which gives you a little bit of a kind of less bright look to it. So that's up to you if you want to kind of change that. But I'm going to leave it with add for now because it's a little bit easier to see, and I want to go ahead and start getting the position of this calculated. So what we'll do is toggle our switches and modes again, and I'm also going to just pull this down so it's actually behind the ball, and then I'll hit the P key to bring up its position. And for right here, that's great. I'll just go ahead and key that there, and then let's move back to when the ball is first lighting up, and I'm going to grab the Y handle and just pull this almost completely out of view and a little bit over to the right, and then that will key there for us. Then we'll be able to key that exposure so that it's not lit up until the ball gets closer. But for now we're just dealing with the position. So we'll come in through here, Then as it goes back here, kind of hits his hand, so we'll push that back in the Y a little bit and over. And then right here we have another hit, so that's going to come a little bit back towards us again. And you'll notice how I'm kind of lining this up with the center bottom of the ball. And then right up there before it starts to go back down, so that's going to get closer to us yet again. And then right there to be underneath the ball. And then back here it's going to hit again, so we'll just push that back over just like this. And then we kind of go up, and then you know it's going to start changing direction, so that's just a little bit over and a little bit over to the left. Then it's going to come back right through here, and we're just kind of following that along. And this one is definitely a lot easier to match move to than actually doing this with the ball. So you can kind of see how that's going to move along. And I'm going to also take all of these and make them easy ease. So select all your keys, go to Animation, Keyframe Assistant, and hit easy ease. Or if you're on the PC, you can hit F9, and that will just quickly do that for you. Okay, so now that's matching up pretty nicely, but we're going to have a little bit of an issue where we want to come in here and work with our scale as well. So I'm going to select my layer and hit Shift S to bring up the scale as well. And one of the interesting things that happens whenever you have a flashlight is that when you get closer to a surface that you've got a flashlight or some kind of something in your hand that is brighter, it gets smaller but more concentrated. So if this is our, let's say this is our 100%, this is our ultimate scale, or we could even make it bigger, which I don't think we really need to do. Let's say right about here is the biggest scale we want it to get. That's actually going to be when it's the farthest away. So right about here is when we have the farthest away. So we'll go ahead and key the scale. In fact, I think it could be a little bit bigger, maybe something like that here. And then when we get close like this, it's going to be much, much smaller. So something like that, but we'll make it more concentrated once we start working with the exposure. Okay, then we go out here, and it's going to get a little bit bigger again, maybe just up to 82 though, because it's not quite as high off the ground. And then here, this is the same always when it's close to the ground. So I'll just copy and paste that key there. And then this one, it's going to get a little bit bigger. And then I'll just hit Control V to paste a small one again. And then again we get a little bit bigger. Hits, and that'll be small. And then a little bit bigger yet again. Okay, same thing. I'm going to easy ease all of these. So go to Animation, Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease. And then I want to play with my exposure. So just starting here, our exposure is going to be pretty kind of blown out here. So I'm going to turn this down pretty far, something like that where we can barely see it. And then as we get down here to the ball, the exposure is going to increase pretty significantly. So something maybe right in there. Okay, so you can tell it's still not even up to 1 yet because I don't want this to be overwhelming. Okay, and then we'll take this back down, not quite so bright. And I'm just going to select my layer and hit the U key so you can see those other keyframes. Okay, so now we can really start just kind of going back and forth because the exposure is going to be pretty similar every time. So this one was the one when it was up in the air. Then we have or this one's up in the air. Then this one's the ground again. So I can grab this key, Control C, Control V. Then we'll skip this one and move to this one, hit Control V. Skip this one, move to the next one, hit Control V. Perfect. So this one is another up in the air. So let's see right here we've got an up in the air level of brightness. So I'll hit Control C, then we'll move forward, Control V, Control V, Control V. And then again we'll want to select all of these, go to Animation, Keyframe Assistant, and Easy Ease those. Okay, so now let's scrub through and see how it looks. Pretty good. Now this one looks like it may have actually gone a little bit farther than necessary, so I'm just going to push that back and over a little bit just there. Perfect. Now I do feel like this is a little over the top, so I'm going to switch it over to screen And then you can see that now we've got a really subtle little effect for relighting our ground. And I'm going to pull this one back slightly as well, just on the Y there. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so that looks great for relighting the ground. In the next lesson, we are going to begin the process for working on relighting his legs. And we are going to be doing that by creating some really tight rotoscopes around both of his calf areas. So we'll just take a little bit of time to begin that rotoscoping process in the next lesson. And then I'll show you how we can reuse those rotoscopes in a really creative way over the next several lessons. So stick around and we'll be rotoscoping